Welcome to Reason and Theology, everyone. I'm your host, Michael Lofton, on a Monday evening or night, whatever you want to call it at this point, around 6 p.m. Central. So I don't know what the convention is. I guess that's evening still, technically. Joined by Craig Truly, an Eastern Orthodox, and Mike Aquilina, a Roman Catholic author. Mike, it's great to have you on the show. How are you?
Hey, thanks for having me back. I'm doing fine. Can't complain.
Excellent. Good deal. Good deal. And I understand that you're currently writing and speaking and doing multiple things. What are you currently writing on, if you don't mind me asking?
I'm doing a bit on the Blessed Virgin Mary in the history of
Hmm.
the church. That's one thing. I've also launched a podcast with CatholicCulture.org. It's called the Way of the Fathers. So
Excellent.
I'm
Eh,
I've been working on that.
So are y'all basically pre-recording things, or are they already starting to be live now?
The Way of the Fathers, the
Hmm.
podcast.
Yeah.
It's been live now for a full month. I think I have or more than a month actually. I think I have 4 or 5 uh episodes released. Actually, the fifth will come out tomorrow morning. Yep.
Good, good. And so your book on the Virgin Mary, any particular angle that you're going at, or just kind of overall the Virgin Mary in the early church, or?
Well, I'm talking about her presence
Mm.
in the church throughout history. So
Hmm.
I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to that. Anything on the Blessed Virgin is going to be exciting. We've
Yeah,
been
me
doing a lot
too.
of debates lately on the Theotokos and different theological aspects pertaining to her. So that'll be interesting for us to read when it comes
Wonderful.
out. Any idea on when that's going to be out?
Probably late next year. That would be my guess.
I gotcha. Yeah, kind of hard to put a date on those things. Well,
Yes.
today we're talking about the church and the Roman Empire, and this is part of a series that you put out, Reclaiming Catholic History. Before I dive into this particular volume, let me maybe ask you why this series? Why the need to reclaim Catholic history? What's the problem with Catholic history the way it's been told so far that it needs to be reclaimed?
Well, I think there are a couple of good reasons for it. One good reason is that there are a lot of urban legends out there in your standard public school curriculum about the church, or about history in general.
Mhm.
You take a figure like Constantine,
Yeah.
much maligned in a
Mhm.
typical high school or
Mhm.
college history course. And for not too many good reasons.
Mhm.
Often he's tarred with the sins of later emperors, his offspring maybe.
Mhm.
But Constantine, for the most part, doesn't deserve the bad reputation that he gets from
Mhm.
people. He doesn't deserve credit for the good things that they try to put on him. Constantine, for example, you know they'll say that he invented Christianity. He
Mhm.
did no such thing. He
Mhm.
invented nothing. If he
Mhm.
invented anything, it was religious freedom.
Mhm.
But we're getting way ahead of ourselves. I That's one reason, is that there are a lot of urban legends out there being taught as history, and we want to set the record straight from those. On the other hand,
Mhm.
Catholics sometimes can be guilty of accentuating the positive to the total exclusion of the negative, not recognizing the faults of the saints, the bad decisions of the saints, giving them a free pass just because they were saints. When
Yeah.
we look at history, we sometimes find that one saint disagreed with the other saint.
Mhm.
So one of them had to be wrong.
Mhm. Right.
so so in this series, we do want to tell it straight. We do want to tell a good story, because that's another fault with recent history, is that it gets so bogged down
Mhm.
that with details that it just reminds the readers of high school history class and everything they hated about it. Memorizing the long lists of dates and getting that map on the test, and you have to fill in the names of the
Yeah.
various countries and their capitals. I don't want to have any of that,
Yeah.
but I do want people to encounter the
Right.
great figures of history as people. So anyway, I
Mhm.
think those are pretty good reasons to launch a series on the history of the church.
Oh, let me interject in that point,
Yeah,
because either Michaelina Aquilina is a great saint with immense humility, or this book is unintentional genius. And let me tell you why. Because I read pretty much everything in this book as the primary sources.
Mhm.
And then I read the book and I see the overarching narrative and the story arc to kind of convey, like you were saying, to reclaim some of these Christians in history that have been kind of maligned in recent scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so like accessible, kind of like if you actually read Eusebius, he's not like really hard to read. That's like a lot of the fathers.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you read the fathers in most secondary sources, it becomes, you have to be, I know, Plato to understand these things.
It's a chore.
And so, like, honestly, I think that there'd be very few books I would actually recommend, like, unless you're, I don't know, like a history major or something in college. Like if you're just a lay person with a casual interest in history, this is definitely one of them. This is a phenomenal book because it's accessible, but because it's also accurate. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of the patristics in as much as it conveys very profound ideas and very consistent with the scriptures teach, with the fathers teach, but not in this impossible to understand sort of way. Mm-hmm. And like I said, so either great sanctity, Mike Aquilina, or unintentional genius. So it really does come out. I really wanted to say that.
I'll bring my wife up here to answer that.
Excellent.
She might have a third hypothesis.
Well, let me maybe talk about Constantine, because you bring it up, and of course you're dealing with the period between 301 and 490, so that's going to be, at least initially dealing with Constantine, and then of course his successors. So when speaking about Constantine, as you noted, we get a lot of different perspectives on him. A lot of people malign him. The Eastern Orthodox venerate him. He's actually a saint in the Eastern churches, mm-hmm. and presumably in the Eastern Catholic churches, I would imagine as well. Mm-hmm. So how is it that we've come to this point that there are so many different views of Constantine, where Christians can venerate him and others can absolutely malign him and say that he was the worst thing ever? How did we get to this point?
Well, he was a politically astute figure from early on, and you figure he had to be. Okay, mm-hmm. He's the son of Constantius I, and he grows up in those imperial circles where intrigue was the name of the game. Mm-hmm. You didn't trust anyone. You didn't trust your family members because you were all vying for the same offices. So there was a lot of distrust. You had to be pretty shrewd, and he was pretty shrewd. He was also a great leader, a great general. So mm-hmm. he finds himself, coming up to Rome, and he's closing in, and he's going to take over. He's going to assert himself as the emperor, mm-hmm. and he succeeds, and he gives the credit to the Christian God. Now, Constantine, before then, had been a worshiper, a monotheist, a worshiper of one God whom he called Sol Invictus, the unconquerable son, the unconquered son. So he may have been a closet Christian from early on. It seems that his mother was a Christian. So he may have been a Christian who was just playing the Roman game until he got in office. There was some kind of mystical experience, it seems, in the battlefield, because all the sources seem to agree on that. He saw a vision in the sky. He saw a vision of the cross or of the Chi-Rho, and he heard the voice that told him to conquer by this sign or in this sign. So he did. He succeeded against all odds. He took Rome. He took the empire, and he made something great of the empire. He managed to unify it in a way that had been elusive for some of his recent successors. And Christianity really was the engine of that cultural renewal that he enjoyed at the beginning of his reign. Christianity gets a lot of the credit. Constantine did not invent Christianity. Everything we know about Christianity, all the things that they credit him with, the canon of the scriptures, the liturgy, all of these things that they say Constantine invented, they were well established hundreds of years before Constantine. So that's baloney, and I do want to set the record straight on that. Constantine did something great, though, at the beginning, and that is he took this Christian idea, which had been first articulated by Tertullian and later developed by Constantine's tutor, Lactantius, and it's this idea of religious liberty, religious freedom. that people should be allowed to follow their own conscience in religious matters. Constantine took that and he made it the law of the land. That's the first time in human history that we find this idea of religious liberty being imposed on an empire, being imposed on a people.
And so, how does that maybe tie into the claim that he forced Christianity on pagans?
Well, I mean, it renders it false, and we
Mhm.
know that it's not true. You
Mhm.
know, that sort of charge is true when it's leveled against some of his successors.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
Constantius, to some degree, his son, uh, to a much greater degree, Theodosius, later on in that century. But it's not true at all of Constantine. He just wanted everyone to get along. He wanted the empire to be unified, ideally as a Christian empire, but he wasn't ready to force that. He wasn't inclined to force that. He wanted people to be able to follow conscience in matters of religion. And he
Mhm.
said this repeatedly. Now, there were times when he favored Christians over other groups.
Okay.
He gave them property, he gave them money, that kind of thing, those things that were at his disposal. And of course, he identified himself as a Christian. He wasn't baptized till he was dying, but he identified himself as a Christian um, through his entire reign.
And you say he favored certain groups. In fact, you even touch on this a little bit in your section on which church is the church, and I want you to maybe talk about that. But here you have his involvement with the Donatists. Clearly, he's
Yeah,
favoring one group over the other.
yeah.
Was there any also persecution involved against the Donatists on his part? Could you maybe talk about that as well?
Well, yeah. He did. He did. It's funny. Christians had been praying for 275 years, about that
Mhm.
long, for what they called the peace of the church. They
Mhm.
they wanted this kind of freedom. They prayed for this kind of freedom. As soon as we had the freedom, we started beating each other up.
Mhm.
You know,
Mhm.
the devil introduces schisms, the
Yeah.
devil introduces heresies, and what we find early on in that period of freedom is uh, is the rise of the Arian Heresy, where this priest in Alexandria denies the co-eternity and co-equality of the Son of God,
Mhm.
and then in Africa we have the Donatist schism, where the Christians who had been faithful in time of persecution really held a grudge against those who had betrayed the church, who had handed over the scriptures, who had given over the keys to the church, um, rather than undergo torture or death. So there's this conflict going on in Africa. Constantine really set himself to solving both of those, and he could be pretty forceful in doing it. I don't think he understood the theological issues. I don't think he
Mhm.
was a theological thinker, but he wanted peace. We see that he wavered and waffled
Mhm.
and moved from one side to the other in the Arian controversy. He remained pretty steady in the Donatist controversy because he saw it as primarily an administrative problem.
Well, and with the Donatists, how did he determine where the church was, or which church is the church? How did he know that the Catholics were right and the Donatists were wrong?
How do you know that in any
Yeah,
circumstance?
how did
Yeah,
he come to
yeah.
that conclusion?
Yeah. He had a good pope on his side, who was willing to exercise the judgment in that case, and he was willing to follow that. What's interesting about the history of the papacy is that Constantine's predecessors as emperors, even those who were pagans, recognized
Mhm.
the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome, and they really relied on him to settle property disputes even in the East.
Mhm.
And
Okay.
on that note, it's
Now you also,
with the
Mhm.
Donatists, they kept appealing to Constantine, and he quite astutely said, "Well, this is a church matter. I don't want to judge this." And then he gives it to the Pope to decide. Then they don't agree. Okay, well, this is still a church matter, and I think the council's in Arles, I forget, but then he pushes off another council. Then they appeal to him again, and he's like, these are just troublemakers. And as you bring out in your book, Constantine liked nothing less than people that create societal instability. and we react very strongly against that. And
Sure.
and so I don't know if we're pushing ahead to this topic too quick in the interview, but this comes out in your treatment of the Arian controversy, where really what brought him one way in the Council of Nicaea was that this was the view of most bishops, and Arius wasn't even a bishop, and pretty much Eusebius and Nicomedia was overreaching, and he kind of earned himself back into Constantine's trust by turning the whole issue on it was the other side that was creating societal instability.
Yes, and it can appear that way. I mean, I have a dear friend who's not a Christian, but he's a historian. He looks at Athanasius and he just sees a man who's fanatical, who's crazy, who cannot compromise, not even one iota. You know, he's willing to undergo repeated exile for the sake of his cause. He won't negotiate with people at all. He won't budge. He seems to be a fanatic from people outside, and you can see how the case could be made against Athanasius, especially if you're living in the, as Constantine was, at a time when the theology of the Trinity was not well spelled out, you know, and your own bishop seemed to be uncertain to some degree.
Here's one of the curiosities that I have when it comes to Constantine. If you could maybe speak to this a little bit, you have him convoking or bringing about an ecumenical council to bring stability to his empire due to the Arian crisis. The bishops, all except two of them, to my understanding, decided in favor of what we would call Nicene Christianity. And so you would think that would have settled the matter, but it did not appear to be the case after that. And in fact, it seemed Constantine wavered on these things because even to the very end of his life, on his deathbed, he's being baptized by semi-Arian, if I recall correctly. So could you maybe speak to this? Well, he calls a council, they rule in favor of something, but then he seems to waffle on it. How does that happen?
Yeah, well, I mean, that what we're probably seeing there is this desire for peace that he wanted. He did not want to initiate anything like a persecution that would be empire-wide, and it would be especially bloody in the East. You know, Jerome had the great line: the world awoke to find itself Arian. The world groaned awake to find itself Arian. It's like this happened overnight. Suddenly, the doctrine spread. Arius was a very gifted man. He knew how to spread ideas. You know, he wrote little jingles with his heresy built into the jingles in a memorable way. So these tunes were running through your head. He was the creator of the earworm. There was when he was not. There was when he was not. And people all over the land were singing that. The doctrine spread that way. It was a seductive doctrine, especially for non-Christians, for pagans who could not deal with the apostolic doctrine of the Trinity. That just seemed crazy to them. 3 does not equal 1. How could that be? But you know, we find Arius spreading his doctrine. We find the doctrine mutating. You know, all you know, they figured out all kinds of ways. The theologians who were sympathetic to Arius, they figured out all kinds of ways to be able to evade a commitment to to Nicene Christianity. So you know, this is happening. It's mutating, and it's I'm trying to think of the term. What's the term for when a cancer spreads and mutates as it spreads? It's metastasizing.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, Arianism was metastasizing. So the Orthodox parties were finding it difficult to dialogue with Arianism because it kept changing.
Yeah, and it did adapt somewhat even after the council, kind of into semi-Arianism
for a century.
Yeah,
And then beyond that, at the edges of the empire, the borderlands, so that it continued out there. But it was a good century that that Christianity within the empire was working it out. Once Constantine was dead, his son who survived, Constantius, was an Arian,
Hmm.
and he was a promoter of Arianism. He knocked out a lot of Orthodox bishops and he replaced them with Arian bishops. And it's estimated that that at that time, later on after Constantine, as many as 70% or perhaps 80% of the world's bishops had gone over to Arianism.
A significant amount, which shows you the majority doesn't always tell you where the truth is.
Right.
So you take up another issue on here related to Constantine, and then after that, I want to get to some of Craig's questions. Sorry for hogging Mike Aquilina here. let me ask one more. You take up the question: did Constantine create the Bible? And I'm assuming you're responding perhaps to Dan Brown readers, or where is this coming from? And could you maybe tell us why he was not the author of the Bible, or the canon of the Bible, of course? Yeah.
Yeah, it's one of those Dan Brown tropes, but I've seen it in other places too. I've seen it said that Constantine settled the canon, for example. Why? Well, because he's the one who printed up Bibles and had them distributed to the bishops. Now, we don't know what that means. We don't know if he made a set of the Gospels, if he had scribes print up the New Testament, or whether it was the entire Bible. That seems unlikely. Just because it would be an enormous project. But but as a result of that, some people will say that he's the one who settled the canon. He's the one who decided that all the Gnostic Gospels are outside, outside the sacred scriptures. But that's just not true. Gospels like the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Peter, all of these extra canonical gospels were recognized as extra canonical a century before that. That's pretty clear.
And it's clear also that if he's going to produce copies of the Bible to be distributed, the canon would have already had to have been settled. So it's not something that he would have.
That wasn't his call. As early as 170 AD, we have Irenaeus of Lyon saying that there are 4 Gospels and telling us what those Gospels are: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then if we read the other books that are cited as scripture through the 2nd century, 3rd century, they're the books that are canonical today.
Right.
There was some dispute about the book of Revelation.
Sure.
Some dispute about the letter to the Hebrews, 2nd Peter, and a couple of other books.
Right.
They were settled pretty early on.
Yeah, the vast majority of the canon really wasn't in dispute. Like you said, it was a few of those extra books. And of course, let me put a hold on that, where I was going to go next. Craig, why don't you jump in here with some of your questions, and I'll come back on the tail end and ask a few more.
I'll just add as a comment, 2nd Peter's quoted in both 1st and 2nd Clement. So it's interesting. It kind of lacks later attestation, but it has very early attestation.
Yeah. And of course, if Peter indeed did die in Rome, as tradition tells us he did, Clement would have had it at hand.
Yeah, which would make a lot of sense. While a lot of the writers of the early church otherwise were sort of out of the orbit, they were really Greeks. Even Irenaeus really was a Greek. But back to what we were talking about before, of the figure of Constantine, which you did such a good job humanizing, his foibles as well as what made him Constantine the Great. And comment on when Eusebius and Nicomedia at first is totally put outside the pale of his inner circle. Constantine speaks of how he has firsthand knowledge that Eusebius and Nicomedia was plotting against him with his political enemies. And yet Eusebius has this about face, and you make the comment that Constantine forgave like a Christian, which I found very compelling, because Constantine also did some things which, like the execution of his son, and I believe also that second wife or whatever, that other things which would be, this does not seem like a forgiving person. So could you kind of speak of that tension in his personality between how he could be so forgiving against people that were his enemies that could have actually got him killed, and yet when sometimes it'd be strictly business, and he might even go too far in pursuing some of those political ends?
He does seem to have had a mercurial personality. The temperature could shoot up and it could drop back down. It seems that what happened was his wife put the idea in his head that his son was plotting against him. So he had his son killed. And then he kind of figured out that no, it was his wife who was plotting against him and against his son. So he had his wife killed at that point. So he had these moments of temper, I guess, followed by remorse. If you want to read a wonderful novel, read Helena by Evelyn Waugh. Helena. It was Evelyn Waugh's favorite of his own novels. And it's a novel about Constantine's mother. It follows her through his life. And I think he got Constantine right. He got Constantine's great strengths, and he got his craziness, because there was a certain amount of craziness that went along with the office. If you lived in that climate, if you grew up in that climate where you couldn't trust anybody, you couldn't trust your own family, it made you a little crazy. It made you a little unsettled. The generation after Constantine was a wreck. His son Constantius had all of his close male relatives executed, just like that, so that there would be no intrigue from within the family. He spared 2 of them because he thought one was too sickly and the other was too young, and he let them live. One of them eventually became emperor.
Now, like on that note, it would seem to me that one couldn't do Constantine's job with a certain level of ruthlessness any more than one could be a successful mob boss. Right? We're not talking about, people think of government as something that was a little more civilized than what it often really is in practice. I mean, especially that period, right? Wasn't there like about 100 years of pretty much military dictator after military dictator, mostly from the Balkans?
Yes.
And so, right, these are all strongmen that took power. They couldn't be wimps and unify the empire. So,
and there was a gradual Christianizing. There are certain ideas that Christianity puts out there. One is human dignity, human equality, human rights. These ideas that we take for granted today, that we consider them the common language of humanity. Well, listen, they're not the common language of humanity. It was Christianity that invented these things and put them out there in the civilizational bloodstream. We have them today in our bloodstream. We take them for granted. Where was I going with that? Oh, with what you said. A lot of these ideas of, like the idea of Christianizing warfare, for example, talking about morality on the battlefield. Man, if you read Byzantine history from the 4th century, 5th century, 6th century, it's not looking very Christian, what they did on the battlefield. It took us centuries to get to the place where we have Geneva Conventions about how you should be conducting war. The idea of a Marshall Plan would have seemed crazy to these people. That's not what you do with your enemies. So I think that the Christianizing of the empire, the Christianizing of the world, has been a very slow process. We're working it out. And certainly through the life of Constantine, he was working it out.
Well, on that note, like in ancient warfare, they sack a city, they kill all the men, they're able to fight, so that way that city can never rise up against them again, and sell all the women and children to slavery, in which obviously, women would be raped or forced to be brides, and the children would be slaves, and that pretty much happened to half of those children.
Yeah.
And but you point out when the Arians take over, and these are Arian Germans, when the Western Roman Empire finally fell to the Germans, that they didn't do that to the city of Rome, even though they were Arians, because it shows 150 years of Christianity marinating within these cultures had a real effect on civilization. I mean, what did Rome do when they took over Carthage? They killed everyone, put salt in the soil, so nothing would ever grow ever again.
Yeah, but you're right. It's a huge difference. We don't see it now, but they go in and they say, "We're going to sack your city." Now, a century before, that would have been very nasty, as you point out. Kill all the men, you take all the women, and you bring up the children as slaves. But it doesn't happen then. They just inform them that they're going to take what they want, and then they're allowed to take what they want. It's a more polite way of sacking the city. Go figure.
Now, before we get ahead, I want to get a little behind what we were talking about before, because your book starts with speaking of this massive plague that decimates the Roman Empire. And it really sets the stage for a lot of things that led to the ascendancy of Christianity, because obviously the pagans see the Christians are the ones, for whatever reason, not touched by the plague. And they're the ones serving those who aren't Christian. And that leads to conversions. And so I'm aware, obviously, of the Black Death, Justinian's plague. Could you speak more about this particular plague in the late 4th century and how that set the stage?
Are you talking about the Plague of Diocletian?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, there were two great plagues during the rise of Christianity. There was one in 250, middle of the 3rd century. It started in 250, went on for decades, and killed tens of thousands. It was brutal. The other one really took place along with the persecution of Diocletian. The first one coincided with the persecution of Decius. So what's interesting to me about both of those plagues is that it really brought out the best in the Christians. During the earlier one, the Plague of Cyprian, it's often called, because the one who wrote about it most extensively was Saint Cyprian of Carthage. During that plague, the Christians were brutally persecuted, and they were blamed for the plague. The Romans said that the reason the plague had come was because the Christians were not offering sacrifice to the gods. This is the way the gods got even. So what did the Christians do? The Christians effectively invented this new cultural institution called the hospital, where they could give long-term intensive care, medical care, professional care to the people who were sick. And Cyprian specifies that they're to give this care not only to our people, not only to the Christians, but to others as well. So you think about it. The Christians were giving medical care in times of plague to the people who were persecuting them, to the people who killed their spouses, the people who killed their children, the people who killed their parents. This is a remarkable thing, and it made an impression. And it's not just recorded in North Africa by Cyprian; it's recorded in other places as well. We have records of it from Alexandria. Dionysius the Great gives us extensive accounts of it, written during that time, a time when if anything he had written were untrue, it would have been contradicted. So we have the emergence of Christian charity into the public square at this time. And we have the emergence of Christian cultural institutions like the hospital. Now, keep in mind, nothing like the hospital had ever existed before in human history. There was medicine before, but there was nothing like the hospital, the kind of medical institution that gave long-term care and welcomed in anyone who walked in off the street. This is a Christian innovation, and it made an impression on the empire. Now, not too long into that century, Constantine becomes emperor, and the hospital is one of the first things that kind of rises all through the empire. And pretty soon, by the end of that century, every city worth the name had to have at least one hospital, and some had as many as 12.
Now, because that kind of brings us back to the era. We're back in now the 4th century. I'm reading page 90, and we're talking to Julian the Apostate. And so we find that we have a Roman emperor who was brought up as a Christian, but he went to the university in Athens. He was inspired by all the stories of pagan lore. And he comes out as a pagan when he's pretty much a head of an army and is an emperor in the West, and he takes over the Eastern Empire.
And to be fair to Julian, I mean, his dad and his uncles and his brother had been killed by the Christian emperor. So that was his view of Christianity. Christianity was murderous. And on the other hand, you have these stories about pagans, that made the great heroes of Greek and Roman history look like they do in museums today. They were men who stood around looking handsome and virtuous with one finger in the air, right?
And so an interesting thing is, a lot of people, like you were saying, think Constantine invented this centralized view of Christianity, when in reality, paganism was something that was very decentralized. Each city had its own cult, and there really was no one way where, let's say, the Roman emperor could centralize paganism. Mm-hmm. Maybe the cult of the emperor would be an exception, but not really paganism specifically. While Christianity already had bishops, had patriarchates, there was a hierarchy among the bishops. Bishop of Rome was the top. This hierarchy was very stratified. It lent itself to a centralization of the government. So now Julian takes over, and he wants paganism to be like Christianity. He wants it organized. Yes. And he wants, well, we need to out-Christian the Christians. We need to have our charities. We need to have our hospitals. And you make the note how they're like kind of confused, like, what are you talking about? This is not part of our tradition. And so I'm going to read the quote, which comes from Julian the Apostate. For it is disgraceful that, when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well, all men see that our people lack aid from us. Mm-hmm. So when he's trying to convince his religious allies, the pagans, he's trying to shame them that they're not Christian enough.
Yeah, and that comes from a letter to a priest. He's trying to get the pagan priests to start acting like Christian priests. He wants them to be chaste. He wants them to be virtuous. He wants them to do acts of charity. And they're like, what are you talking about? This isn't part of the job. Priesthood was something that aristocrats did in their free time. So there's a very funny scene. I mean, he didn't think it was funny, but he arrives in Antioch and he wants to go to this famous temple and see the rites there. Well, he arrives, the temple's in disarray. It's falling down because nobody goes there for the sacrifice anymore. He sees the priest, and the priest is this old, bedraggled man who's walking along, followed by a duck. So there's a duck waddling behind him. It's the most comical scene, and really it is a metaphor for what was going on in paganism at the time. It was temples on a shopping mall, as Rodney Stark said, but the temples were all empty. It's like you've walked into a dead mall. There are no customers there. Nobody's interested in paganism.
No, it kind of reminds me, it's analogous to what we have now in society, right? We have secularists that would say, we don't need Christianity to have all these morals. We could do this better. And they're sort of like Julian the Apostate. Mm-hmm. They're taking all the stuff from a Christian heritage, a Christian upbringing, and they're trying to find, well, why can't we do this? Why can't we have compassion without this worldview? So I thought, not that you make that connection in the book, but I think that's something a reader would identify, because it's pointed out so accessibly. And by the way, Mike, if you want to interrupt me, go right ahead, because I could keep going.
No, you could go with a few more, because I have a few others that are a little unrelated to this that I'm going to come back with, at the end.
Okay.
So you're good.
So on the note of the way that the Christian Roman society, with, again, all its flaws, go no further than reading the ecumenical councils, and they're talking about how much money it takes to pay off a bishop so he'd be quiet, and what kind of pension he needs, and all these things. You go, this doesn't sound so Christian.
No. No,
But
the accounts of the Council of Ephesus read like something out of William Faulkner. They're so grotesque, They were there in the brutal heat of summer, and they had all these delay tactics because they were hoping that the older bishops would drop dead, and they did. They obliged. It's a crazy scene, and of course, we all know about the fist fights at the Council of Chalcedon. And the Bishop of Constantinople, the Patriarch, being beaten to death. Well, he died of his wounds later on, but this was a rough and tumble world.
And so, but you make this point, right? Because again, it's not the glorify. It's rough and tumble. It's a society that's just becoming Christian, where what they understand as politics is very assertive and aggressive. But you make this point. You say no pagans are thrown to the lions for entertainment the Christian crowds. No pagans are burned alive to illuminate the Emperor's Gardens party.
Yes.
So we have to be honest with what the flaws were of this Christian society, but in a sense, those flaws make clear how different a Christian Rome was from pre-Christian Rome.
And the reason we can identify them as flaws is because we're judging them by Christian principles. It's only because we're judging them by Christian principles that we can point out, look, there's no place for that kind of violence in a culture. If you look at every other culture before Christianity, you find out that kind of violence was pretty standard.
Now let's talk about Theodosius, because you referred to him before. If I remember right, he's the one who codified the Edict of Thessalonica, which officially made intolerance of paganism law, which it wasn't before that point. And there's some interesting episodes with St. Ambrose, and also, I believe, in Antioch with the statues. Mm-hmm. So could you comment on those and the relevance to this burgeoning Christian movement within the Roman Empire?
Well, there's a big concern, of course, that they're not going to be able to hold it together. And as we know, in the next century, but just a generation later, really, things begin to fall apart. The walls of Rome are breached for the first time. The impossible happens, and Rome is sacked. So Theodosius has this real worry about unifying the empire, and he doesn't see the possibility of peace as long as there is religious division within the empire. So he tries to force it. Okay, he's following not long after Julian the Apostate, so he's trying to undo what Julian did during his brief reign, and he's trying to show the strength of Christianity, to bring the empire together. So he makes Christianity obligatory on the people in the empire. If you're not going to be Christian, you're going to be taxed for it. You're going to be marginalized, and I think in the long run that's not a good thing. He may have seen some short-term gains, but in the long run, I think that was bad for Christianity. You mentioned Ambrose, and that's an important episode, because Ambrose is someone who knew Theodosius, and he knew him well enough that he could speak with him. And Ambrose, to back up a little bit, what happened was Theodosius. There had been an uprising. You mentioned the episode with the statues in Antioch, where the people of Antioch were rioting, complaining about taxes. It's what they always do. But they went a step further, and they defaced the statues, destroyed the statues of the emperor and his family. Big mistake. They could have died for that. Instead, he was merciful. He killed only the perpetrators, or the people who were identified as perpetrators. In Thessalonica, something much worse happened. There was a similar incident. Everyone was called into the amphitheater, and there they were slaughtered. Thousands were set upon by the soldiers who were there, and they were killed. And so when When Theodosius returned to the administrative capital in Milan, he's met by the bishop, Ambrose, who refuses to admit him to church, to admit him to communion. So he effectively excommunicates him until he does penance, until he apologizes in public. He says in a letter, Ambrose admits in a letter that he expected to be killed for that. And it's surprising that he wasn't. But Theodosius had a lot of admiration for Ambrose. He called him the only bishop worthy of the name, and he was willing to stand up to Theodosius and call him out and call him to account according to Christian principles. You wish you could see a lot more of that in our day.
And the interesting thing about Theodosius is with the episode, the charioteers and everything, he sends this horrific order, kill them all. And then he waits a little bit, goes, oh, that's awful. He sends the opposite. So it pretty much cuts short how many people got killed. Mm-hmm. But, you make the comment, what made him great was he did his penance.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
He didn't just kill Ambrose, put in some sycophant. They'll do what he wants. He did his penance.
Yes, because there was precedent for that. but he did his penance. Ambrose is an interesting figure because he showed himself on at least 3 occasions willing to stand up to emperors. Now, Ambrose himself came from an aristocratic family. He had served as governor in Milan, the administrative capital city. And so he knew what happened in those circles. He knew what was likely to happen to him if he ran afoul of the emperor. But repeatedly, he showed himself willing to run afoul of the emperor. He refused to attend a council that had been summoned by the emperor. He refused to turn over a basilica church to the Arians, because he wasn't about to do that. Instead, he occupied the basilica with his congregation, and they sang hymns as the soldiers closed in. And then the third occasion that I'm thinking of was when he confronted Theodosius. He was willing to do this. He showed himself willing to do this repeatedly.
Now, on a slightly different topic, you make the passing mention that Jerome thought he almost became Pope. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because that sounds like a funny episode.
Jerome was a priest in Rome. He was very prominent, especially with the women in the noble families. There were a great many widows who had pretty much set their houses up as religious communities, what we would today call religious communities, where they dedicated themselves, these women dedicated themselves to charitable work, to praying the Psalms, and to studying the scriptures. Their tutor was Jerome, who was one of the great scripture scholars of antiquity. So he was doing some things that were pretty innovative, and he was a pretty influential man. He was a secretary to Pope Damasus. Many people think that he was sure he was going to be the successor to Pope Damasus, and when that did not turn out to be the case, he kind of found a good opportunity to leave Rome and go back east and set himself up with the monastery in the Holy Land.
Now, what do you think a Jerome pontificate would have been like? Because he lived such a long time.
He did live a long time, and also he was an irascible character. Oh my! There's a great poem about him by Phyllis McGinley. It goes, God's angry man, his crotchety scholar, was Saint Jerome, the great name caller, who cared not a dime for the laws of libel, and in his spare time translated the Bible. And it goes on from there. It's several verses. But Jerome was kind of known for his temper. And he often unleashed his temper on people we today recognize as saints.
Augustine.
He thought Augustine was a proud man, and he chastised him for betraying their friendship.
Uh-huh.
He thought Ambrose was a plagiarist. He accused him of plagiarism. He thought John Chrysostom was overrated. So this is the kind of thing you get from Jerome's writings. I think he was eminently unsuited to be pope. It would have been a comical reign. It's the kind of thing that would have been a wonderful novel by Evelyn Waugh, but it probably would have been a difficult pontificate.
Now, it's the target audience for this book. Obviously, it could be read by Roman Catholics, and I think that'd be its most built-in audience. But I cannot help, when I read it, feel that it's written to be very accessible to Protestants and people maybe just more interested in history, not particularly religious. And so was that something you were purposely trying to work in, or it just kind of came out that way?
I don't think it's what I'm purposely trying to do. I don't think I have like an agenda for doing that, but it's kind of the way I try to live. So it should be the way I try to write. I do think that we have more in common than we have separating us. This is especially true of Catholics and Orthodox Christians. I mean, we have a lot that unites us. And it's the same thing with much of Protestantism. There's a certain theory that's been advanced by many people that we'll get over a lot of our differences once we're in the catacombs together, once we're persecuted, and that does seem to be a pattern in history that God lets us undergo these difficulties together so that we'll draw together, and I've seen that happen in my lifetime, especially with the pro-life movement. I've been active in the pro-life movement since I was very young, and what I saw then was that was that our president Ronald Reagan pretty much told us to stop being silly, that we needed to band together on this issue, and we needed to march together. And the March for Life has been a great testimony to that down the years. So I mean, I think that kind of ecumenism is possible. I think it's fruitful, and it's what I try to live. I'm glad it's getting into the books.
Now, there's a few points that you put in the book. They're not necessarily directly relevant to the overall story arc, but they're introductions to Roman Catholic ideas. You end the book on the papacy, whether it's a medieval invention or not. But you make an interesting comment on the Marian issue. And so I'm going to ask about this book, not your future book, because that's all hidden information for now. You make the point that in the first 6 centuries of the church, there is a known Marian apparition in each of those centuries. And so this is because we have a very educated audience that follows this channel. It's kind of a game. Which fathers are you referencing, or which writings are you referencing for the Marian apparitions in the first 6 centuries of the church?
You're putting me on the spot. Let me see if I can remember them all. In the first century, we have a couple that are attributed to the apostles. Okay, the first is obviously the apparition that was granted to the apostle John, which we find recorded in the book of Revelation, chapters 11 and 12. Where Mary is revealed as the Ark of the Covenant in heaven. That would be the first, and it's the primary one because it's canonical for all of us. The other one in the first century would be that granted to the apostle Thomas, according to tradition, where he was not able to get to her bedside at her death when the others all made it there, and so Thomas was granted a vision of her. And he was given one of her garments so that he could hold on to it as a relic. So those are the two early on. The next one would be St. Gregory the Wonder-Worker, which is recorded by Gregory of Nyssa. It took place in the 3rd century. The record we have of it is in the 4th century. Is from the 4th century. St. Gregory of Nyssa. In the 4th century, there are two that I'm aware of. Both of them are in Egypt, and I forget the saints who are associated with them. I apologize for that. The one that I was thinking about at the end of the 6th century is the one that was related by Pope Gregory the Great in one of his writings about a girl in Rome who had a Marian apparition. So I mean, those are the things I was referring to. I'm sorry that I'm blanking on some of the details right now.
No, it's just been an ongoing topic. Monday is usually Mary Monday on the show. Today it's Aquilina Monday, but
well,
but
it's funny. I'm not my mother was very much devoted to the apparitions of Fatima and Lourdes, and she had the gift of understanding them and of trying to live according to their messages. I've never received the gift. I've never been a Catholic who's drawn to apparitions. Who's spent a lot of time studying them, as you've seen. I even blanked on the 5th century there, and I can't remember the names of the 4th century saints they're associated with. But I think that's more something that I lack. It's a gift that my mother had. It's a grace that she had that is not genetic.
No, a lot of these gifts aren't. There's so much more we could talk about, but then I'd say that guys have to get the book. Let me take the post-it note off. It'll look nicer. Guys have to get the book to know more about it. But it's actually in the beginning. You make a mention of St. Agnes. And it reminds me, because St. Ambrose talks about her. And you speak of how Agnes had reached a marriageable age and she was strikingly beautiful, and these things that are from the saint's life. I have kind of a two-part question. First, did you ever get to see her relics? Have you ever been to Rome and get to see her relics?
Every time I go to Rome, I visit the Church of St. Agnes in Piazza Navona, and I visit them every time. I'm very much devoted to her. My oldest daughter is named for her, Mary Agnes, and my mother was Mary Agnes as well.
Oh.
And I have 5 daughters. She's the patron saint of young girls and of Girl Scouts. So I do have a great devotion to her. She's something. And when you think about it, she's a figure. I think she was pivotal in history, and some historians agree with that. But within 100 years of her death, we have all of the great intellectuals writing lives of Saint Agnes: Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose. All of these people, Prudentius. All of these people thought it worth their time to set down a life of Agnes. She was such an important figure for these figures we consider important, especially us in the Western Church. These are our great fathers.
Now, so you can help me with this. I remember I went, my wife and I went to the church. We venerated the relic there, and I was with a friend of mine, who's a Roman Catholic priest who now lives in America, and we looked at the skull, and it looks very small. And he's like, "Could skulls shrink?" Because we knew the saints' lives, how she's no marriageable age, and so like, was it just how we saw it? What's your impression of the skull size and things like that? Because it makes me reflect that oftentimes the saint lives, they elaborate certain things to convey theological points. So oftentimes the women are beautiful because it's an outward portrayal of their spiritual beauty and things to that effect. So the relics make her appear younger, at least to me. What's your educated view of that, being that you've seen them more often than I have? It sounds like you've seen them quite a bit.
Yeah, I don't know. I've never heard anyone bring that up before. It may be the distance that makes them seem small. People were smaller then. That's another thing. But I don't know. I guess it didn't strike me that way. But anyway, yeah. So I don't know how to address that if it didn't strike me on my visits. But I imagine they've been measured and that kind of thing. And if it was obviously the skull of a smaller child, it wouldn't be displayed now. The place was just renovated, in a kind of grand way. They spent a lot of money renovating the church, and if I think if the skull were contradictory to the story in terms of just the basic biology of it. The skull would not be on display now any longer.
See, I would actually view it as the opposite, because if they so don't jive, at least on the surface, right? That'd be more the reason if, because we know there's fake relics out there too, that, we're going to get a different skull for this one. But the fact that's the one that was held on to, I think lends a lot of credibility to this St. Agnes.
Yeah. She could have been as young as 11, and because you could be married off at 11. And apparently she was very beautiful. According to the account, she was blonde, which would have made her stand out again. And she came from a noble family, so she had everything you were supposed to want in a wife. And there was a shortage of pagan women because a lot of the pagan females ended up on the dung heap. Infanticide of females was fairly common, so she would have been highly desired by the upper class Romans. When she turned down a proposal of marriage, it kind of meant the end for her.
Mike, I have a question for you, shifting gears just slightly, but still talking about women. You deal with the issue of Christianity and harming potentially the status of women. How do you take up this issue in your book, where you argue that, and I know it's a brief part of the book, but you argue that Christianity did not harm the role and status of women in society? What would you say to those who say, well, in fact, it did?
Oh man, well, it's funny. We talked about the hospital, the emergence of the hospital, and once Christianity was legalized, what we find is that a great many women emerged as leaders within the church, and especially the leaders who were establishing hospitals. This became kind of a job that women did, especially the wealthier women, especially widows, who had the fortune and now had the time to give to this task. They established the hospitals, they worked the hospitals, and they became great heroes. What you find with Christianity is that women emerging as teachers very early in the history of the church, and this was not something common in the culture. Okay, it's something that the pagan apologist Celsus or Celsus derides us for, that we welcome women. We welcome them into leadership. We call them deaconesses, and we give them the training of other women. We welcome women into the congregations. It's an amazing thing that happens. Perpetua keeps a diary in prison, and it becomes a bestseller among Christians in the world. That's pretty cool. You don't see that happening with pagan women over time. You'd be hard pressed to find as many pagan women writers as you find Christian women writers. If you look at the literature of pagan Greece and Rome, the Greco-Roman world, what you find is that all the epic heroes are men. And they're men who are particularly aggressive and warlike. The hero is the guy who eviscerates the enemies, right, and pulls out their intestines, and we describe it in great detail. Who are the Christian epic heroes? People like Perpetua, like Blandina. These women coming to the fore, showing great courage and not killing others, but rather they're willing to be killed. They're willing to endure tortures for the sake of Jesus Christ. If you're a pagan woman, you get your identity from your father, your husband, or your sons. All of your value derived from the men in your life. Christianity changed that, so much so that women could pledge their virginity to Jesus Christ and remain single all their lives and not be impoverished for it. This is a remarkable and revolutionary development, and it was recognized as revolutionary. It was seen by the Romans as anti-family because it was something that just upended their whole idea of what women should be doing. It's because of Christianity that women could come forward as cultural leaders, and they did.
Excellent. Yeah, and some of that carries over, I suppose, from Judaism. Would it not, or was this just unique to Christians?
No, no, you're absolutely right. It was a carryover from the Old Testament heritage, the heritage of Israel,
Mm-hmm.
that women were seen as having this dignity and
Hmm.
emerging as leaders.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah,
it's
they were there in the congregation when the Torah, was being read. You have even judges, ruling over Israel, female judges. So there's definitely a role of women there in the Old Testament. So it does seem like some of that carried over.
but I do think it came to its full flourishing in Christianity, and I think
Hmm.
it's because of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Hmm.
It's because of her place in Christian life, in Christian history, Christian literature. The first great Christian bestseller was the Gospel of Mary, what we today call the Proto-Evangelium of James. Um, this is a book about the life of Mary
Yeah.
from her conception, onward, and there was enough interest in the Christian world for that book to become a bestseller. This is what Celsus mocked about the Christians, that we made heroes of women.
Yeah, no, I think the reason why the Virgin Mary has that impact is because she's the antitype, if you will, of Eve. She undoes and reverses what Eve did. What Eve bound, she loosed, and you see that in Justin Martyr and several other early church fathers. So I think that's why she is seen in that light. She kind of restores dignity to womanhood. Whenever, I mean, the pinnacle of Christianity, in Christian sanctity, is the Blessed Virgin Mary, right?
She's a game changer.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, indeed. Um, we have some questions here from the chat. Is it okay if I ask a couple of those?
Yeah, yeah.
This one is from Sociologo. He says, uh, takes a second there, I guess, for it to come up on the screen. Usually it's a little quicker than that.
Woo, this is
I
an
don't,
eye test.
I
okay,
see
I
it.
think you can see it
Yeah.
now. Okay. And I can adjust it, by the way, here so that I can get it a little bit larger. If that would help.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Yeah,
How can
there
a
we go.
Catholic or Orthodox cope with the totally anti-Christian historiography out there? How to
Mhm.
know what is true or false? Um, well, I think that there are a great many non-Christian writers coming to our defense right now and defending the truth that's there in history. Right now, we're living in a time when one of the bestsellers is Dominion by um, Tom Holland, the guy who wrote Rubicon and Persian Fire. So he's an established best-selling author, a historian, and he writes this history of Christianity. And what he wants to do is to show that Christianity was a revolution, and it was a revolution that established all of these ideas that we love. Again, the idea of human dignity, human equality, human rights, and put these so firmly in place that we cannot imagine a world without them.
Mm.
So Holland writes this book, and at the end, in the last chapter, he admits that he doesn't have faith. But he's looking back on Christian history, seeing the contributions of Christianity, and worrying about what the post Christian world will look like. It's a great book. I recommend it. It's not perfect, but it's a great book. And again, it's a view from outside because this is a man who doesn't have faith. Another great writer of recent years is Rodney Stark, who started his work when he was an agnostic. He wrote The Rise of Christianity, Cities of God, and other sociological studies of early Christianity. And what he did was debunk the anti-Christian historiography that Sociologo is talking about. So there are good people coming from outside our circles who are teaching us how to respond and and counter the arguments of the anti-Christian historians. Also, we have great Christians writing today, like Robert Louis Wilkin, who's
Mm.
still very active, who just wrote a wonderful history of the idea of religious liberty.
Mm.
I was drawing from it when I was speaking earlier about Tertullian and Lactantius. So there are a great number of good Christians writing history today, and we can draw from them and learn from them.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned it because we were just a moment ago in the live chat talking about Wilkins' work, The Spirit
Yeah.
of Early Christianity. Yeah,
Yes.
good. Okay, this one is from Justin. Let me pull it up here. Taking a second for some reason again, but it'll come up here in a second. Okay, Mike, how is the Roman Catholic Church coping in an era without any real state protection like the age Theodosius ushered in and continued into the Holy Roman Empire until Karl I? So,
That's a wonderful question. You'll have to ask God, because only God knows. And God is the one who's working out our history providentially. And we tend to think of the great actors in history as the kings and the generals and the people who are on the front page of the New York Times. But I really, really, truly believe that the great actors in history are often the people who are terminally ill, the people who are beggars on the street, the people who are sitting right now in prisons, unable to do anything that would land them on the front page of the New York Times. They are changing the world because of small acts of charity. Things are changing right now, and they're changing in a big way. But I don't think that the great changes are the ones that we're observing. God is working something great right now in the Christian church. And we get hints of it every now and then, but I don't think we see it clearly because we're thinking about it in terms that are too grand. There is something troubling about the age we're living in, but I think that's because God is working out something great in history right now.
It has to be the case.
Yeah.
Surely he's not working out
Yeah.
something bad. He
Yes.
has to bring something good from all this.
Yes. Yes. And if we
I
look,
agree.
if we look at every period in history, every period has had its challenges, and God always comes in some surprising way.
Yeah.
The way you never would have expected to renew his people. He's not going to abandon us. We just have to remain faithful.
We sure need that today. But yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Romans 8 makes that clear. It works all things for good for those who love him.
Yes.
And are called according to his purposes. This one is from Ben. He says, what material would Mike recommend in order to have or learn the best hermeneutic when studying history?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you interpret historical documents accurately?
Let me think about that, because nothing comes to mind that puts out the principles. The way you can pick it up best, I think, is by seeing how it's done by a master like Robert Louis Wilkin. If you can start with one book, make it the spirit of early Christian thought, and then go from there to the first 1,000 years, and you'll see how he does it. People often come down on critical scholarship. Well, Wilkin is a master of critical scholarship, but he also is quite obviously a Christian believer who sees God working out his purposes in human history. So you can do both, and Wilkin shows us how.
This one is an interesting one. Is it something you've come across in your study of the fathers? Do any church fathers identify Peter and or the rock of Matthew 16 with Daniel 2 and the rock kingdom that overcomes the kingdom of iron and clay, which cannot mix? I've never seen them connect the two to my knowledge. I know, of course, the rock there in Daniel is the Roman Empire, and of course, Christianity takes over the Roman Empire. But I've never seen any church fathers connect Matthew 16 with Daniel 2. Have you?
I have this dim memory that there are Syriac fathers who deal with this. Maybe it's Afrahat, but I remember seeing a book on the Syriac fathers and the rock, and it was the reason I remember it is because I couldn't afford it. It's one of those times when you're on the website and you're looking at it and you think, I want that book.
Right.
And I can't remember the title of the book. I do remember it's that publisher that puts out a lot of Eastern Christian stuff. It's in New Jersey. And I can't remember the publisher's name either. But they do a lot of good titles in Eastern Christianity.
I'm sorry. Find it with the Google search. No problem.
Yes.
This one is from CJ2135. What were Constantine's views on the source of political authority? Where does political authority come from? Did it come from God or come from man or somewhere else?
I can only assume that he believed it came from God, because in his case, he believed that God had intervened miraculously to install him as the ruler of the world empire. So it seems to me that because of that extraordinary circumstance, there's only one way he could go with that. He didn't always show that kind of trust in his reign, obviously, if he killed his wife, if he killed his son. But he must have seen God's favor in that initial event, and throughout his reign.
Yeah. Gregorian asks, what does Mike think of the theory that Philip the Arab was actually the first Christian emperor, not Constantine?
It's quite possible. He did hire he hired Origen, I believe, as the tutor for his mother, and he supposedly kept Christ among the idols in his private chapel. I don't know if he was a Christian or just kind of a what we'd call a seeker today, someone who's kind of open to what he could learn from world religions. For what, I don't know that we can say more than that.
Mm-hmm. This one is from Father Deacon Daniel Dozier. He says, what do you think about the thesis of Father Vincent in Apostolicos Thronos, in which he contrasts the imperial ecclesiology of Eusebius with the Petrine ecclesiology of St. Athanasius? And then he goes on to say, it seems that these two positions are emphasized at various times in church history. So you have this pitting of imperial ecclesiology versus Petrine ecclesiology. But what do you think of that in the early church?
I think Father Toomey's book is wonderful, and I wish it would come back into print, because I think it's almost impossible to lay your hands on a copy these days. I own one. I'm happy to say, but it's a wonderful book, and I think it pretty accurately describes what was going on at the time. Of course, these two men are trying to work out these great ecclesiological questions in a time of crisis, and trying to do it in a way that's politic as well, because they know that they have to deal with the emperor, and that he's going to be the key to their success in worldly terms, one way or another. I think you're right. Down through history, that's been a back and forth. We're still trying to work that one out today, and I think that that in the Roman Catholic Church, the events of the last 150 years have kind of forced us to confront the issue, with the loss of power of the papal states,
Right.
The popes living as exiles within the Vatican, prisoners of the Vatican, and so on, so that their only authority could be moral authority. Right. And I think that moral authority reached a kind of zenith with Pope John Paul II.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, I mean, ecclesiology is still being debated today, especially after the Second Vatican Council. So more to come.
More to come.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. Craig, did you have any concluding questions or thoughts before we conclude here?
I just want to say it's been really great having Mike on tonight. And I don't know, my son is less than 4 months old. I can't wait till he learns to read. I want to read this one day. It's not because it's a children's book per se. It's something where I think, I mean, I learned reading from this, and I read a lot of the primary sources in it. It really takes someone who I think really understands the point of history. History is to convey more of an overarching idea. We want to be accurate, but we also want to have, I don't know, some sort of moral to the story. Otherwise, then why are we learning it? Otherwise, my stuff ice road truckers on the History Channel. We want something that's profound that we're going to get from this. And I really think this book is amazing in covering a topic which is very relevant, because there's a lot of cynicism about the nature of early Christianity, and especially institutional religion. And I think this is a very good response to that, whether that was intentional or just somewhere in the subconscious, I don't know. But it's really good, and I really think the audience should do themselves a favor and get a copy.
Thank you, Craig. That's very kind of you. I did try to humanize these people and show them with all their faults,
Mm.
because I understand the cynics. I understand where they're coming from. Because when you face kind of saccharine histories or histories that ignore the difficult characters like Jerome or Cyril of Alexandria, it's not true to life. But when you tell their stories and you help people to understand them and understand their motivations, you can see that God continues to work as he worked all through the Bible through people who are deeply flawed, and he has a pattern of making saints out of these men and women.
Yeah, Jerome is definitely one of my favorite. I wish we could talk more about him. But again, thank you so much for coming on, Mike. This was absolutely enjoyable. Your second time on. Hopefully, you'll be on again, Lord willing, anytime you're available. We're more than happy to have you on. Next book that comes out, more than welcome to come on and we could talk about it.
Send me dates. I'm eager for the next conversation. I always have a great time.
Absolutely. So where would you recommend that people buy this directly? The church in the Roman Empire. Would you say Amazon, or is there a preferred other location?
Hey, I'll tell you what. If you go to catholicbooksdirect.com, catholicbooksdirect.com, if you go there and you use the code FATHERS, that discount code FATHERS, it's a coupon code, you'll get 10% off the already discounted price at that website. So try that. Go to catholicbooksdirect.com. I think you'll get the best price.
Excellent. Awesome. I haven't heard of it before. Is it just your books that they're offering at a
Oh, no.
discounted rate, or others too?
Others too.
Great. Wow. Awesome. Well, we got a good tip there.
I think every child wants to pull this out of their stocking.
You know what? This is the kind of stuff that I do want for Christmas. That's what I want. So.
Me too.
I remember when I was 18 and I got the book Fahrenheit 451 for Christmas. Like, what kind of Christmas gift is that?
Well, it's good to know that I'm not alone here, because I used to actually use my money for food on occasion on books, deliberating food or books. Nah, I don't need
my
one.
Amazon wish list is about a dozen books and a shoehorn.
Right. That's awesome. Again, thank you for coming on, Mike. I'd love to have you on again when your next book comes out. I'll shoot you some dates.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Bye-bye.
Everybody, thank you for watching. God bless you all. Please comment, like, share, subscribe. Thank you for watching. Until next time, go share your faith.